Welcome back to our read aloud of Explorers, The Race to the Moon. So you see the introduction here. And we are continuing to read about the moon mission itself. Destination Moon. The Apollo 10 mission was planned to test the lunar module in orbit around the moon. Only if it was completely successful would the landing go ahead. In May 1969, Apollo 10 lifted off and headed for the moon. As part of the test flight, 2 astronauts in Apollo 10's lunar module descended, that means went down, to within 8.6 miles of the moon's surface, but did not land. They rejoined the main ship and returned to Earth. Here is something about the Apollo 11. Apollo 11. In 1969, Apollo 11 was named as the craft scheduled to make the moon landing. It consisted of 3 parts, or modules. The command module was nicknamed Columbia and would carry the astronauts for most of the journey and return with them to Earth. Attached to Columbia was a service module which housed the rockets and fuel that would be needed for the round trip to the moon. The lunar module, which was called the Eagle, would take 2 of the astronauts down to the moon. After they had explored the surface, the Eagle's rockets would fire to carry them back to Columbia, orbiting above. So, this actually doesn't have a great picture, but we'll zoom in here and see it. So the command module is this little kind of cone on the end, and that's where that's kind of the only thing that would go all the way to the moon and come back to Earth. Here's the service module, which is this little tube or cylinder with a rocket on the end of it. And then the lunar module was the Eagle, and this is what actually went down to the moon. So to get this all out into space, they had to put it on this rocket, but then they actually had to, once they got into space, spin this thing around and attach it to the lunar module so that they could keep going. You see the lunar module, as it's set up in the rocket, is not actually attached to the command module, so they had to spin it around and do that. And why did they do that? Well, it had something to do with this escape system. If the mission failed, if there was a safety problem during the launch, this little rocket at the top could take the command module with the astronauts in it off and get them to safety. But that meant we needed to, in space, kind of reassemble this thing and shoot that thing off. All right, so that's kind of the setup of the Apollo 11 mission here. Saturn V. The Apollo craft was so heavy that von Braun had to design the largest rocket ever built, the Saturn V, to blast it into space. It stood 364 feet tall and was assembled at Cape Canaveral, Florida, in a building so tall that clouds sometimes gathered at the top at night. Wow. The rocket burned a mixture of kerosene and liquid oxygen. Here's the mission badge for the Apollo 11. The astronauts picked for the Apollo 11 flight were Neil Armstrong, Edwin, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. All 3 were born in 1930 and were experienced pilots. Let's get a zoom out here and look at the Saturn V rocket. This rocket had different stages. So the rocket would burn all the fuel in this stage, and then the bottom part would actually fall off in space, and then these next engines would light, and the second stage would go, and then this part would fall off again in space, and the third stage would go. So that you kind of like let this big heavy junk fall away once it's used up all its fuel. That lets you get into space a little bit more easily. Saturn V had 3 stages. Each was jettisoned or cast away once its fuel was used up. This lightened the load to be carried upward. In training. Before the missions, the 3 astronauts practiced every move in machines called simulators, which worked just like the Apollo craft. Once clear of Earth's gravity, all astronauts experience weightless conditions. They're floating around in space. Aldrin, Armstrong, and Collins trained underwater to prepare for this. Being in outer space feels a little bit like being floating in the water. We have liftoff. Launch day for Apollo 11's mission was July 16, 1969. The morning was clear and bright as the astronauts were driven across the base to the launch pad, where the Saturn V rocket towered high above it. The astronauts were taken to the top in the launch tower lift. 2 hours before takeoff, the 3 astronauts took their seats in the command module. Buzz Aldrin, who would help fly the lunar module, sat in the center. On Aldrin's left was Neil Armstrong, the flight commander. He would be the first to step on the moon. On his right sat Michael Collins, the command module pilot, who would stay on board. At 9:32 a.m., Apollo 11 was cleared for takeoff. On the launch pad, dressed in bulky spacesuits, the astronauts were helped into their seats aboard Columbia. Then Columbia's hatch was closed. Mission Control informed the astronauts, "You are go for launch." Remember, Columbia is this cone, the command module on the top of the rocket. So they're strapped in there for the launch. Spectators. Thousands of spectators, which means people who came to watch, had gathered at a safe distance to see Apollo 11 blast off. Millions more followed the event on television or radio as the astronauts made their final preparations for takeoff. The launch of Apollo 11. Liftoff. 3, 2, 1, 0. We have liftoff. The excited ground crew at Cape Canaveral watched as Apollo 11 rose into the air. The engines of the Saturn V rocket burned 16.5 tons of fuel per second and produced one of the loudest sounds ever heard. After 3 minutes, the launch escape tower, which was fitted over the command module, was jettisoned. Now the astronauts could see out. Heading into space. 9 minutes into the flight, the second rocket stage burnt out and was jettisoned. The third stage engines took over as the rocket roared upward. 11 minutes after takeoff, Apollo 11 and the third stage rocket reached Earth's orbit. Final checks were made before heading to the moon. On course. 3 hours into Apollo 11's flight, Mission Control in Houston gave the astronauts permission to head for the moon. The engines of the third stage Saturn rocket blasted the spacecraft free of Earth's orbit. Then, as Apollo hurled toward the moon, Michael Collins took the center seat for a difficult maneuver. He had to disengage Columbia from the rocket and turn around to dock with the lunar module, which had been housed inside the third stage. So that's what I'm talking about here. They had to get the lunar module out of its little tube, and they had to put it on the top of the rocket. So this was difficult, tricky. They gave the pilot the job to do that. His name was Michael Collins. Collins performed this delicate operation perfectly. Docking. Collins maneuvered the command module of Apollo 11 toward Eagle with the help of small rocket thrusters on the sides of the service module. You can kind of see them firing here. They're little orange jets on the side there coming out. Then Columbia docked gently with the lunar module. Collins reversed to disengage it from the Saturn rocket, so he kind of pulled out here to get it out of the rocket. Supplies. Apollo was well stocked with supplies. Its emergency survival kit included a life raft in case the crew landed off course on return. To save on weight, food was freeze-dried and sealed in packets. A typical meal was chicken or salmon with rice, pudding, cocoa, and juice. So, the diagram above shows the highlights of the Apollo mission. Armstrong and Aldrin were due to land on the moon on July 21st. If all went according to plan, the command module containing all 3 astronauts would splash down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th after a flight lasting 8 days. Ooh, that's a long time to be in space. This diagram on top shows the moon's Columbia in the moon's orbit while Eagle is on the moon. See, Columbia here is still out there while the Eagle is landing. It's a pretty cool diagram. Time to rest. During rest periods, the astronauts slept in sleeping bags tied below their seats so they would not float away across the cabin. That's kind of funny. That's where we're going to rest for now. We'll read more in our next read aloud.